The wedding dress still hung in Margaret's closet, untouched for 7 years, like a ghost of dreams that never came to life. Every morning, as she reached for her business suits, Margaret caught a glimpse of that ivory silk, and every morning, she wondered what her life might have been if David hadn't vanished without a trace on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. But perhaps, just perhaps, some disappearances aren't what they seem, and some love stories don't end where we think they do. Margaret Collins was 47 when this story truly began, though the roots stretched back to that devastating Saturday in 2017. She had built herself into one of Boston's most respected financial advisors, transforming her pain into purpose, her heartbreak into a thriving business that helped others secure their futures. Isn't it fascinating how our greatest wounds sometimes become our greatest strengths? The morning that would change everything started like any other. Margaret was reviewing quarterly reports in her corner office, the October sun streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, when her assistant knocked softly on the door. "There's someone here to see you," Rebecca said, her voice carrying an odd tension. "He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's about your past." How many times had Margaret wondered what she would do if this moment came? How many sleepless nights had she spent imagining David walking back into her life? Yet nothing could have prepared her for the reality of seeing him standing in her reception area, older now, his dark hair touched with silver, but still unmistakably the man who had promised to love her forever and then disappeared like morning mist. "Hello, Margaret," David said, and his voice carried the weight of 7 years of silence. She led him into her office, her hands surprisingly steady as she closed the door. The successful businesswoman she had become took over, the one who negotiated million-dollar portfolios and never showed weakness. "You look well, David. I trust you have a good reason for being here." But David looked anything but well. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and hard decisions, and when he sat across from her desk, Margaret noticed his hands trembling slightly. "I need you to know why I left," he said. "I need you to understand that leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done, and I've spent every day of the last 7 years trying to make it right. How do you respond to words you've longed to hear but never believed you would?" Margaret found herself caught between the successful woman she had become and the heartbroken bride she had once been. 7 years, David. 7 years of wondering if I had done something wrong, if I wasn't enough, if our entire relationship had been a lie. "It was never about you not being enough," David said, his voice breaking slightly. "It was about me trying to protect you from something I couldn't control." The story that unfolded in that office was nothing Margaret could have imagined. 3 days before their wedding, David had received a call that changed everything. His younger brother Marcus, the only family David had left, had been kidnapped while on a business trip to South America. The ransom demand was $30 million, money that David had, but with conditions that made it impossible to involve police or anyone else. "They wanted me to disappear completely," David explained, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "No contact with anyone from my old life, no trace that could lead back to Marcus. They said if I tried to maintain any connections, if I tried to explain to anyone where I was going or why, they would kill him." Margaret's mind raced back to those final days before their planned wedding. She remembered how distracted David had seemed, how he had claimed it was just pre-wedding nerves. She remembered the phone calls he would take in private, stepping out onto the balcony or into another room. "The phone calls," she whispered. "Those mysterious phone calls the week before our wedding. That was them, wasn't it?" David nodded, pain etched across his features. Every call was another demand, another threat. "They knew everything about you, Margaret. Your schedule, your favorite coffee shop on Newbury Street, even the route you took jogging every morning. They showed me photos of you from that week, photos taken without you knowing. I was terrified every second that something would happen to you because of me." The weight of this revelation settled over Margaret like a heavy blanket. All those months she had wondered if there had been signs she missed, if she had been naive or blind to some fundamental flaw in their relationship. Now she understood that the distance she had sensed wasn't David pulling away from her, but David trying desperately to protect her while his world crumbled around him. "I wrote you letters," David continued, his voice barely above a whisper, Dozens of them explaining everything. I would write them and then burn them because I couldn't risk anyone finding them. Even now, I have every word memorized. The letter I wrote the night before I disappeared started with "My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, then something terrible has happened, and I need you to know that leaving you is killing me more than any bullet ever could." Margaret felt the world shifting around her. "So you just left? Without a word? Without trusting me enough to trust you?" David's voice rose slightly. "Margaret, I loved you so much that the thought of putting you in danger was unbearable. These weren't people who made empty threats. They had photos of you, of your apartment, of your daily routine. They made it clear that anyone in my life would become a target. Have you ever had to choose between love and life, between your heart and someone else's safety?" Margaret stared at this man she had once planned to spend her life with, trying to process the magnitude of what he was telling her. "Your brother, is he alive?" David said, and for the first time she saw relief in his eyes. "But Margaret, those 4 years." His voice trailed off as he struggled to find words for experiences that had clearly marked him forever. "They moved me around constantly. Colombia, Panama, Ecuador. I lived in shacks, in safe houses, sometimes in caves in the mountains. They wanted to make sure I could never be traced, never found. I worked in their operations, laundered money, did things that kept me awake at night. All to keep Marcus alive and to keep you safe." Margaret watched this man she had once known so intimately describe a life that sounded like something from a nightmare. "What kind of work?" she asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. "I became their accountant, their financial strategist. My business degree, my knowledge of international banking, it all became tools to help criminals move money around the world. Every transaction I processed, every account I managed, I told myself it was to save Marcus. But there were nights when I would lie on a cot in some compound in the jungle and wonder if I was becoming someone you could never love again." The David she had known had been scrupulously honest, almost to a fault. He had been the kind of man who returned extra change to cashiers and insisted on paying his full share of taxes. To imagine him forced into criminal activity was almost as heartbreaking as imagining him choosing to leave her. "After we finally got Marcus out, after the last member of their network was either dead or in prison, I spent 3 more years trying to make sure they couldn't hurt anyone I cared about ever again. I hired security firms, private investigators, former CIA operatives. I needed to be absolutely certain that coming back to you wouldn't put you in danger." The silence that followed was heavy with 7 years of missed birthdays, holidays, anniversaries that never happened. Margaret walked to her window, looking out at the city she had conquered in David's absence. "Why now? Why come back now?" David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, the same style as the engagement ring he had given her 8 years ago. "Because a life without you isn't a life worth living," he said. "Because I've spent 7 years building a fortune that means nothing if I can't share it with the woman I love. Because I'm hoping that somewhere in the successful, incredible woman you've become, there's still a part of you that might forgive me." Margaret turned back to face him, and the tears she had held back for 7 years finally began to fall. "You don't understand what you did to me, David. I blamed myself for months. I threw myself into work to forget the pain. I built walls so high that I haven't let anyone get close to me since." "I know," he whispered, "and I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But I'm asking for the chance to spend the rest of my life making it up to you. Isn't it strange how love can survive even the deepest wounds? How the heart can remember what the mind tries to forget?" Margaret looked at this man who had caused her the greatest pain of her life, and underneath the hurt, she could still feel the ember of what they had once shared. "I need time," she said finally. 7 years of silence can't be erased with one conversation and a ring box." David nodded, setting the box gently on her desk. "I'll wait as long as you need. I've learned patience the hard way." Over the following weeks, David proved he was serious about earning back her trust. He didn't push or pressure, but he was present in small ways. Flowers appeared at her office with notes that simply said, "Thinking of you." He donated anonymously to the charity she supported for single women starting their own businesses. He waited outside her building some evenings, not to intercept her, but simply to make sure she got to her car safely. But Margaret wasn't making this easy for him, and part of her knew she was testing him in ways that weren't entirely fair. She would work late deliberately, knowing he was waiting outside. She would schedule dinner meetings that ran long, watching from restaurant windows as he sat in his car across the street, patient as a statue. She was looking for signs that this new David might abandon her again when things became difficult. One evening, she decided to confront him directly. It was raining heavily, and she had stayed at the office until nearly 10 o'clock, working on a presentation that could have waited until morning. When she finally emerged from the building, she found David standing under a street lamp, soaked through because he had given his umbrella to an elderly woman she had seen struggling with her groceries an hour earlier. "Why are you doing this to yourself?" she asked him as they stood there in the rain. "Why are you letting me torture you like this?" David wiped the rain from his face and gave her a sad smile. "Because I tortured you for 7 years without even being here. Because if standing in the rain every night for the rest of my life is what it takes to prove that I will never leave you again, then I'll stand in the rain." That night, Margaret invited David into her building for the first time since his return. They sat in the lobby, both dripping wet, as she struggled with emotions she had thought were buried forever. "I built my entire life around never needing anyone again," she told him. "I made myself successful enough that I would never have to depend on another person for my security or happiness. And here you are, asking me to risk all of that again." "I'm not asking you to give up anything you've built," David replied. "I'm asking you to share it with someone who understands what it means to lose everything and find the strength to rebuild. Margaret, what you've accomplished in these 7 years is incredible. You took your pain and turned it into purpose. You helped hundreds of families secure their financial futures because you knew what it felt like to have your future stolen from you." Margaret found herself caught between the life she had built and the life she had once dreamed of. Her friends were divided, some urging her to give love another chance, others warning her that a man who could disappear once might do it again. But what weighed most heavily on her mind wasn't the opinions of others, it was the question that kept her awake at night. Could she trust her heart to someone who had broken it so completely? The answer came on a snowy December evening when Margaret was leaving her office late. She slipped on the icy sidewalk and felt strong arms catch her before she fell. It was David, and in that moment, looking into his eyes, she saw not just the man who had left her, but the man who had sacrificed everything to save someone he loved. "Why are you here?" she asked, though she was still in his arms. "Because I couldn't bear the thought of you walking to your car alone on such a dangerous night," he said. "Because even if you never forgive me, I still love you enough to want to keep you safe." That night, for the first time in 7 years, Margaret invited David for coffee. They sat in her apartment, the same apartment he had known so well, and talked until dawn. He told her about the sleepless nights when he had almost broken his silence, about the detective work that finally led to his brother's rescue, about the therapy he had undergone to deal with the trauma of those lost years. "There was one night about 2 years in when I was in a compound in the mountains of Colombia," David said, his voice distant with memory. "The guards were asleep, and I had managed to get access to a satellite phone. I dialed your number and listened to it ring. You answered on the 3rd ring, and when I heard your voice say hello, I almost spoke. I almost risked everything just to hear you say my name one more time." Margaret set down her coffee cup, her hands trembling slightly. "What stopped you?" "Marcus. They had just sent me a video of him that day, proof he was still alive but showing what they had done to him for my supposed good behavior. He looked like he had aged 10 years in 2. I knew that one moment of weakness, one word from me, could be his death sentence." Margaret shared her own journey, the pain of rebuilding her life alone, the success she had achieved but the emptiness she had carried. "I became so focused on being independent that I forgot how to trust," she admitted. "But David, there's something I need to tell you. Something I've never told anyone." She walked to her bedroom and returned with a small wooden box. Inside were dozens of letters, all addressed to David at various forwarding addresses she had tried over the years. "I wrote to you too," she said softly. For 3 years after you disappeared, I would write you letters telling you about my days, about the business I was building, about how much I missed you. I sent them to your old office, to your lawyer, to anyone who might know where you were. They all came back marked, return to sender, or addressee unknown. David picked up one of the letters, his hands shaking as he recognized Margaret's handwriting. May I? She nodded, and he opened a letter dated 6 months after their canceled wedding day. His eyes filled with tears as he read her words. I dreamed about you last night, and when I woke up, for just a moment, I forgot that you were gone. I reached across the bed for you, and the emptiness felt like drowning. I've started a business helping people plan for their futures because I never want anyone to feel as unprepared for heartbreak as I was. But David, wherever you are, I need you to know that despite everything, I hope you're safe. I hope you're happy. And I hope that someday, somehow, you'll find your way back to the people who love you. Trust isn't something you can force, David said. It's something that grows back slowly, like a garden after a harsh winter. 3 months later, on a warm spring morning, Margaret called David with her answer. But before she could give him that answer, she needed to do something she had been putting off for 7 years. Meet me at the church, she said. The same church where we were supposed to get married. David found her standing in the empty sanctuary, still decorated with the flowers that a different couple had chosen for their wedding the day before. Margaret was holding the original wedding dress she had finally retrieved from her closet, the one that had haunted her for so many years. I need to let go of the woman I was that day, she told him. The woman who was so sure that love was enough, who believed that nothing could ever tear us apart. That woman was naive, but she wasn't wrong to believe in love. She just didn't understand that sometimes love means making impossible choices. Together, they walked to the small garden behind the church where Margaret had once planned to take her wedding photos. She had brought a small shovel, and there, under the same oak tree where she had wanted to pose with her new husband, she buried the dress. I'm not burying our love, she explained as she patted down the earth. I'm burying the fantasy of perfect love that never gets tested. I'm burying the idea that love means never having to make hard choices or sacrifices. David knelt beside her in the dirt, his expensive suit forgotten as he helped her complete this ritual of release. What are we planting in its place? He asked. Margaret looked at him. This man who had been through hell and back, who bore the scars of choices that would have broken lesser people. And she saw not the boy she had fallen in love with years ago, but the man he had become through suffering and sacrifice. We're planting a love that's strong enough to survive the truth, she said. We're planting a love that's been tested by fire and survived. The second proposal happened not in some grand romantic gesture, but in Margaret's kitchen on a quiet Sunday morning as they read the newspaper together like an old married couple. David got down on one knee beside her breakfast table and opened the same velvet box he had left on her desk months before. Margaret Collins, you are the strongest, most incredible woman I know. You took a broken heart and built an empire. You took abandonment and turned it into independence. Will you marry me? Not because of who we were, but because of who we've become. Their wedding was small and intimate, held in Margaret's garden with just their closest friends and David's brother Marcus, who had flown in from the new life he had built in Australia. There were tears, but they were tears of joy mixed with healing, of second chances and dreams that had found their way back home. As Margaret walked down the makeshift aisle in a simple cream dress, so different from the elaborate gown that still hung in her closet, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Sometimes we think our story is over when it's really just beginning. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about perfect beginnings, but about the courage to begin again. Their marriage wasn't without challenges. There were moments when old fears surfaced, when Margaret's walls went up or when David's protective instincts became overwhelming. But they had both learned something valuable in their years apart. That true love isn't about never falling down. It's about always getting back up together. The first major test came 6 months after their wedding, when David's former captor's associates made contact, demanding money in exchange for information about other kidnapping operations. David's immediate instinct was to handle it alone, to protect Margaret from the knowledge that their past might never truly be behind them. But Margaret had learned to recognize the signs of David withdrawing, and she confronted him before he could fall into old patterns. "We promised each other no more secrets," she reminded him as they sat in their kitchen. The police report spread between them on the table. "Whatever this is, we face it together." Working with federal authorities, they helped bring down an entire network of international kidnappers, with David's inside knowledge and Margaret's financial expertise proving invaluable in tracking the money trails. The case took 8 months to resolve, but throughout it all, they never once doubted their decision to face it as a team. Another challenge came when Margaret's business was offered a lucrative acquisition by a major financial firm. The deal would make her incredibly wealthy but would require her to relocate to New York. The old Margaret might have made the decision independently, protecting herself financially above all else. The old David might have encouraged her to take it while secretly fearing she would leave him behind. Instead, they spent weeks talking through the decision together. They visited New York, explored neighborhoods, imagined what their life might look like there. They also considered what they would be leaving behind in Boston, the community they had built, the life they were creating together. In the end, Margaret turned down the acquisition, but she negotiated a partnership that allowed her to expand her firm while staying rooted in the city where they had found each other again. "Some opportunities are worth taking," she told David, "but some roots are worth keeping." 5 years later, as Margaret celebrated her 52nd birthday surrounded by the blended family they had created, including Marcus's wife and children who visited every Christmas, she looked back on that devastating wedding day in 2017 with something she never thought she would feel: gratitude. The celebration was held in the backyard of the home they had bought together, a sprawling colonial that was nothing like the modern condo they had planned to share as newlyweds. This house had character, history, and rooms that had witnessed both joy and sorrow, much like the people who lived in it. Marcus had flown in from Australia with his family, and watching David with his nephews, Margaret was struck by how the years of separation had made their reunion even more precious. Marcus had his own scars from those terrible years, but he had built a beautiful life in Melbourne with his wife Sarah and their twin boys. The children called Margaret Aunt Maggie, and had no idea that their Uncle David had once been the most wanted man by an international criminal organization. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had told you the truth from the beginning?" David asked her that night as they sat on their deck, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. The party guests had gone home, but the warmth of the celebration still lingered in the air. Margaret considered the question that had haunted both of them for years. She thought about the young woman she had been, so certain that love could conquer anything, so naive about the complexities of real life. She thought about the successful businesswoman she had become, forged by heartbreak but strengthened by survival. "I think that young woman would have insisted on coming with you," she said finally. "She would have thought that love meant never being separated, no matter what the cost. She might have gotten us all killed with her determination to prove that nothing could tear us apart." David reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "And I think the young man I was would have let you, because he thought protecting you meant keeping you close rather than keeping you safe. Maybe some love stories need to be broken before they can be made whole," Margaret continued. "Maybe we needed to lose each other to understand what we really had. Maybe we needed to prove to ourselves that we could survive alone before we could choose to be together." Her business had grown into one of the most successful financial planning firms in New England, and David had used his resources to establish a foundation that helped families of kidnapping victims. Together, they had created something bigger than either of them could have achieved alone. But perhaps the most beautiful part of their story wasn't the success or the second chance, but the way they had learned to be vulnerable with each other. Margaret had discovered that true strength wasn't about never needing anyone, but about choosing to trust someone worthy of that trust. David had learned that protecting someone you love doesn't mean shutting them out, but bringing them close enough to face whatever comes together. On quiet evenings, when Margaret looked at the wedding photos from their second ceremony, she marveled at how different she looked from the young woman in the dress that still hung in her closet. The older Margaret's face showed lines of experience and eyes that had seen heartbreak and healing. She looked like a woman who knew her own worth, who had been tested and emerged stronger. So here's what I want you to consider. How many times in your life has something that seemed like an ending turned out to be a beginning? How many doors that slammed shut led you to windows you never knew existed? Margaret and David's story reminds us that sometimes the most devastating losses prepare us for the most beautiful gains. And sometimes the love we think we've lost forever is just waiting for the right time to come home. Their story teaches us that forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past, but about choosing to write a different future. It shows us that real love isn't about never facing obstacles, but about facing them together. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that we are never too old for second chances, never too hurt to heal, and never too independent to choose love again. What story in your life seemed finished but might actually be waiting for a new chapter? What hurt have you been carrying that might be ready for healing? Sometimes the most beautiful love stories aren't the ones that start with "once upon a time," but the ones that begin again with "what if we tried once more?"